The women huddled in the cold, grim and bruised, not knowing what to expect from the strangers who had captured them. The war had stripped them of everything they knew: honor, dignity, and a sense of certainty. They had been taught to believe that their fate was sealed, that the enemy would show them nothing but contempt. Yet, as Christmas approached, the unthinkable happened. The guards, a group of cowboys, stood before them, their boots worn and hats tilted against the cold sun. Without a hint of malice, one of the men stepped forward, his voice warm and steady. "You're invited to join us for Christmas dinner." The women could only stare in disbelief. It wasn't just the invitation that shocked them. It was the kindness in their eyes. In a moment that defied everything they had been taught, they were forced to question. Could their enemies be more than monsters? Could they be human? The women stood together, their clothes torn and faces streaked with dirt, their eyes wide in disbelief as they watched the American soldiers approach. After months of battle in the Pacific theater, they had become accustomed to the violence of war, the shrieking of bombs, the relentless heat, and the crushing weight of their training under the Bushido Code. Surrender, they had been taught, was worse than death. It would bring dishonor to their families, their emperor, their country. To be taken prisoner was an unforgivable fate, one that would condemn them to suffering beyond imagination. They had braced themselves for the worst, certain that death, starvation, or torture was the only option that awaited them. But as they raised their hands and the gunfire ceased, what followed was not the cruelty they had expected. The first soldier who approached them was not holding a rifle, but a water canteen, offering it with an expression that held no trace of hatred. His face was tired but kind, his eyes gentle. He spoke to them in slow, deliberate English, but his tone was not mocking or taunting. It was steady, almost compassionate. The women couldn't comprehend what was happening. The same enemy they had been trained to despise now stood before them offering help, not harm. For a moment they hesitated, unsure whether this was some cruel trick or an actual act of mercy. One of the women, a nurse who had seen more than her share of bloodshed, took a tentative sip from the canteen. The water was cool, refreshing, a stark contrast to the brackish, foul-tasting liquid they had been forced to drink in the jungle. The American soldier nodded, as though this simple act of kindness meant something beyond words, as though it was a gesture of humanity he could offer to those who had been taught to view him as a monster. This first contact, so simple yet profound, was a shock that reverberated through their hearts. They had expected to be humiliated, tormented, maybe even killed. Instead, they were being treated as human beings. They had been told that American soldiers were savages, but now, as they stood face to face with them, they saw only men, tired, weary men like themselves. It was almost impossible to reconcile the image they had been fed of their enemy with the reality in front of them. The clash between the rigid honor codes they had grown up with and the reality of their captivity was jarring. For their entire lives, they had been told that honor was found in dying for the emperor, in sacrificing everything for the greater good of their country. Surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a stain on one's very soul. To be taken alive, to be shown mercy, would be seen as a betrayal of everything they held dear. The shame would be unbearable, they thought, and yet here they were, still alive, still breathing, and offered not death, but care. The women looked at one another, their minds struggling to process this new reality. What they had expected and what they were experiencing could not have been more different. The ideals of Bushido had prepared them to face death with honor, but they had not prepared them for the possibility that mercy could exist, even from the enemy. As they settled into the camp, they began to feel the weight of this truth, a truth that felt like a betrayal of their very identity. How could they reconcile the kindness they had been shown with the teachings they had lived by? The first few days were a blur of confusion and disbelief. They were treated with respect, given food, and provided with medical care for their wounds. In the silence of the camp, they sat together, unsure of how to process what was happening. Their minds were still caught in the fog of war, the shock of their capture still fresh. The idea of surrender, of being shown compassion by the enemy, was something they had been told could never happen. And yet, here they were, experiencing it firsthand. For the first time in their lives, they had to confront the possibility that the enemy was not the monster they had been taught to fear, but another group of human beings caught in the same war. It was a painful realization, one that would take time to fully process, one that would change them forever. As Christmas approached, an unsettling stillness settled over the camp. The women, still adjusting to the strange civility of their captivity, found themselves caught in a web of confusion. The days blurred into one another, marked only by the rhythmic sounds of American boots on the ground and the clinking of mess kits. Despite the kindness they had received so far, there was an ever-present tension, an undercurrent of suspicion that none of them could shake. They had been raised to believe that surrender would bring shame, that their enemies were merciless. Yet every day, the reality of their situation challenged everything they had been taught. The camp's routine was mundane, even monotonous. Mornings began with the sound of a bell, a harsh reminder that they were no longer free. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with the women standing in line, their heads lowered, unsure whether the food they were receiving was some form of trickery. Lunch and dinner came with the same hesitations. The American guards watched them silently, their expressions unreadable. There were no insults, no threats, just a quiet, almost eerie efficiency. The food, always plentiful and nourishing, contrasted sharply with the rations they had known during the war. But the nourishment felt like an insult in itself. How could they accept such kindness from the enemy when their own people were starving back home? The women had been warned that there would be no mercy in captivity. They had been trained to endure anything, to suffer without complaint. But this treatment, the care, the food, the warmth, felt like an affront to their very identity. Every act of kindness by the soldiers seemed to erode the walls of hatred they had built up over the years, and yet they clung to them, unwilling to let go of everything they had been taught. It was during this tense time, just days before Christmas, that the unexpected happened. One morning, a group of soldiers, dressed not in the standard military uniforms they had become accustomed to, but in worn cowboy hats and boots, approached the women's barracks. The women froze, their hearts racing. Was this some new form of torture, a humiliation they hadn't anticipated? But instead of the harsh commands they were used to, the men spoke to them with surprising gentleness. "We're having a Christmas dinner tomorrow night," one of the soldiers said, his voice warm. "We'd like you to join us." The words hit the women like a punch to the gut. Christmas dinner? With their captors? The idea was unthinkable. How could they sit at a table with the very soldiers who had taken them prisoner? It was a question they could not answer. They exchanged confused glances, their minds reeling. Had they misunderstood? Was this some kind of psychological game? The invitation was made in earnest, the soldiers' faces showing no malice, only a quiet expectation. As they left, the women were left to wrestle with the offer, unable to decide how to react. The idea of sitting down with the enemy to share a meal, especially on Christmas, was beyond their comprehension. It was both a temptation and an affront. Could they put aside the years of hatred, the years of propaganda, and accept this offer? Or was it a trick meant to destroy their last shred of dignity? As the day passed, The tension only grew. The women were torn between the desire for warmth and food and the internal struggle over pride. Would accepting this invitation betray everything they had been taught? And yet, the prospect of a warm meal, of being treated as human beings rather than as prisoners, stirred something deep inside them. Their bodies, weak from months of deprivation, longed for the comfort the soldiers offered. But could they truly allow themselves to partake in such an act without dishonoring their families, their country, their emperor? In the silence of their barracks, the women sat in uneasy council. Some wanted to refuse the invitation outright, clinging to the pride they had left. Others, exhausted and hungry, began to soften, the lure of a warm meal proving too much to resist. Still, the question lingered in the air. Could they accept this unexpected kindness without losing themselves? As they pondered their decision, memories of their past lives began to resurface, memories that felt like echoes from a world long gone. They had been raised in a society where honor, sacrifice, and duty were more than mere values. They were the very foundation of their existence. From the earliest moments of their childhoods, they had been taught that to live without honor was worse than death. For women like them, the idea of surrendering to the enemy was incomprehensible, a betrayal not just of their nation, but of everything they held dear. In these flashbacks, their childhoods were filled with discipline and sacrifice. The harsh, repetitive drills of their youth were not merely about physical strength, but about fortifying their will. The girls were taught to endure pain, to suppress weakness, to give everything in service to the emperor. The women recalled the lessons from their mothers, who had often said, "Honor is everything. Without honor, you are nothing." It was drilled into their bones from an early age that death was preferable to dishonor. Whether in battle or in captivity, they were to be silent, resilient, and unbroken. For those who had become soldiers or nurses, the training had been even more intense. The nurses were taught to tend to the wounded with efficiency, to suppress any emotions, to place the mission above their own lives. They had been conditioned to see death as a part of life, a natural consequence of war. To them, the thought of surrender was not only disgraceful, but unimaginable. They had been prepared to face death head-on, to give everything, even their own lives, for the cause. The soldiers, too, had been trained to die rather than retreat. Their battlefield training was brutal, their minds and bodies honed for the ultimate sacrifice. There had been no place for weakness in their education. Each day had been spent learning how to fight, how to resist, how to endure the unimaginable. They had been taught to face pain with stoicism, to never show fear, and most importantly, to never show mercy. The war was their purpose, and they were willing to sacrifice everything for it. As their memories deepened, the women could almost hear the propaganda that had filled their lives, the constant barrage of speeches and films that demonized the Americans, portraying them as ruthless, heartless invaders. The Japanese leadership had carefully crafted an image of the enemy as a monstrous force. Intent on destroying everything that was good and pure about Japan. The American soldiers were not men. They were savages, mercenaries driven by greed and bloodlust. To even imagine a man in an American uniform showing mercy or kindness was inconceivable. The very idea of Americans offering anything but cruelty went against everything they had been taught. The conflict within the women was palpable. How could they reconcile the values they had been raised with, the values that had shaped their very identities, with the kindness they had been shown by the Americans? It was a question that would not be easily answered, and the weight of it seemed to press down on them as they sat in silence. Could they accept mercy without losing their honor? Could they break the chains of propaganda and see their captors as human beings, not demons? As the evening wore on, the women's reflections began to shift. The invitation to dinner was no longer just a simple offer of food. It had become a symbol, a challenge to everything they had known. It was a test, not of their strength or endurance, but of their ability to let go of the past and face a new, uncertain future. In that moment, the Christmas invitation became more than just a meal. It was a confrontation with the very beliefs that had defined them. And as they prepared to make their decision, they could not help but feel that their lives and their understanding of the world were about to change forever. The next evening, when the time came, the women hesitated at first, standing together near the gates of the camp, unsure of what awaited them. The cold air seemed to press in on them, making the decision feel heavier, more real. They had been told that they would be served by the very men who had captured them, the ones who had been their enemies on the battlefield. Yet, as they made their way to the mess hall, that sense of uncertainty began to transform into something else. As they entered the hall, the first thing they noticed was the warmth, a stark contrast to the chill of the night air. The smell of food, real food, hit them like a wave, a deep, comforting aroma of roasting meats, freshly baked bread, and something sweet, perhaps pie or fruit. For a moment, the women stood frozen, eyes wide in disbelief. This was nothing like the starvation rations they had grown used to in the jungle. The food that had been passed to them by their captors so far was nothing compared to this. The women, hungry and weak, could not remember the last time they had eaten something so rich, so full. It was as if their senses had been overwhelmed. Their minds were still filled with the horrors of war, but now their stomachs urged them forward. The guards, dressed in their cowboy hats and worn uniforms, greeted them with unexpected warmth. There was no sneer or mockery in their faces. Instead, they smiled, genuinely, and gestured toward the tables with friendly hands, as if inviting them into a home, not a prison. The women shuffled forward, awkward and uncertain. The American soldiers were not standing over them with rifles, demanding compliance. They were acting like hosts, not captors. Plates of food were passed to them, and one soldier even offered them a warm mug of what smelled like coffee. The camp's usual silence had disappeared, replaced by soft laughter, clinking silverware, and the hum of conversations. As the women took their seats at the long table, they could hardly believe what was happening. They were surrounded not by enemies, but by men who seemed, at least for this moment, to be just ordinary people sharing a simple meal. As they ate, the American soldiers continued to act as if this was a simple, ordinary meal. They did not watch the women with suspicion or hatred. Instead, they smiled at them, making small talk, asking about their health, and speaking with a warmth that felt almost too familiar. It was not what the women had expected. There was no cruelty here, no mocking, no jeering, nothing but the kindness of men who seemed to see them as more than just captives. Yet, for the women, this moment of unexpected humanity carried with it an overwhelming sense of shame. Their pride, ingrained through years of training and indoctrination, screamed at them to resist, to refuse the food, to reject the kindness. But their bodies, starved and exhausted, betrayed them. As they ate, their minds struggled to reconcile the kindness before them with the propaganda that had shaped their world view for so long. How could they sit here, in the heart of the enemy camp, eating their food, accepting their kindness? What did it mean about their country, their honor, and their emperor? Still, as the meal went on, the soldiers' behavior continued to break down the walls the women had carried for so long. The guards, far from being the monstrous figures of their imaginations, were showing them a human side, one that made it harder to cling to the hatred they had once felt. The soldiers were not the enemy they had been told to fear. They were men, struggling with the same war, the same suffering, the same wounds. And as the evening stretched on, the women, for the first time in months, began to feel the warmth of something other than fear. The meal had continued in a strange, almost surreal silence, broken only by the clink of silverware and the occasional murmur of gratitude from the women. The soldiers moved around the table, their smiles now less cautious, more genuine, as they refilled cups and offered more food. But it was when the women began to speak, tentatively at first, that the true shift began. The walls between them, which had seemed so impenetrable just hours before, began to crack, piece by piece. One of the soldiers, a young man with rough hands and a weary face, began to tell a story of his home in Texas. He spoke of wide-open plains, of horses running free, and the smell of fresh-cut hay. His voice was tinged with nostalgia, but there was something else there, something that spoke of a life that had been torn apart by war. "Back home," he said with a small laugh, "we used to have a big Christmas every year. My mama would make the best pies. You've never tasted anything like it." His voice trailed off, as if the memory was bittersweet. "This year it'll be different, but I reckon we'll make do." The women listened, their faces a mixture of curiosity and caution. They had heard stories of their American enemies, but never had they imagined they would be listening to one of them speak so openly. The soldier's words carried with them a humanity they had been taught to ignore. In his story, he was not a faceless enemy, but a man with a family, with memories, with emotions. The idea that he too had a life beyond the war began to take root in their minds. Another soldier, quieter than the first, spoke up. He had grown up in a small town in Michigan, where the snow fell thick in the winter and everyone knew each other's name. He spoke of the Christmas traditions they had, gathering around a fireplace, singing songs and sharing stories. His voice was gentle, almost shy, but the women could hear the pride in it, the pride of a man who had once been part of something simple and beautiful, now lost to the chaos of war. As the stories flowed, the women began to exchange glances, each one struggling to process the humanity that was unfolding before them. For so long they had been taught to view the enemy as less than human, brutal, merciless, driven by greed and hatred. But now, seated at this table, listening to the soldiers speak of their homes, their families, their lives, the soldiers were beginning to look less like the monsters they had imagined and more like men. One of the women, unable to contain herself any longer, spoke up. Her voice trembled at first, but it steadied as she continued. She spoke of her home in Japan, of her family, and of the sacrifice she had been taught to make. The others listened in silence as she shared her deepest fears, the fear that surrender would bring dishonor to her family, to her country. But as she spoke, she felt a shift within herself. The walls she had built for so long began to crumble, piece by piece. The soldiers, for their part, listened intently, nodding as they heard the words of the women. They, too, were surprised by the strength they saw in these women, the resilience that lay behind their guarded eyes. They had expected to face anger, defiance, perhaps even hatred. But what they saw instead was something far more complex. Women who had been shaped by a culture of sacrifice, yet still clung to their humanity despite the horrors of war. The first real conversation between captors and captives had begun, and with it, both sides began to see each other in a new light. It wasn't just the soldiers offering food or warmth, it was the sharing of their stories, their lives, their vulnerabilities. It was the realization that despite the lines drawn by war, they were not so different after all. The emotional impact of that realization would stay with both the women and the soldiers for the rest of their lives. A quiet revolution of thought sparked over a Christmas dinner. The days after the Christmas dinner were marked by a quiet, uncomfortable shift in the camp. The women, still reeling from the warmth and kindness they had encountered, began to feel the weight of their internal conflict more keenly. The walls they had built around themselves, shaped by years of propaganda and cultural conditioning, were crumbling in small, unexpected ways. They had been taught to see their captors as monsters, ruthless men who would show no mercy. Yet, as each day passed, they were faced with the undeniable truth. These soldiers were not monsters. They were human beings, just like them, struggling with the same war, the same fears, the same pain. How could they reconcile this new reality with the beliefs they had been raised with? They had been taught that surrender was dishonorable, that to show any sign of weakness was to betray their country and their emperor. They had been trained to face death without hesitation, to die with honor rather than live in captivity. And yet, here they were, alive, cared for, even respected by the very men they had been taught to hate. The tension between loyalty to their country and their growing empathy for their captors was becoming increasingly palpable. Every act of kindness, every shared moment of human connection made it harder to hold on to the beliefs that had shaped their lives for so long. One woman, who had been quiet throughout the previous days, finally spoke up. Her voice was soft, but the words cut through the tension in the air. "How can we keep hating them? How can we say they are monsters when they treat us like this?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered. The others shifted uncomfortably, their minds swirling with the same doubts. The idea that mercy could exist in an enemy's heart was a concept that had never been allowed to enter their thoughts. Mercy, they had been told, was weakness. To show mercy was to fail in the most fundamental way. And yet, the acts of kindness they had received from their captors were not acts of weakness. They were acts of humanity, small and simple, but profoundly disorienting. The women were left to grapple with this new understanding. Could mercy be a strength rather than a weakness? Could their captors' kindness be a reflection of their own humanity rather than a ploy to break them? The conflict was not just internal, it was cultural. Their entire lives had been shaped by the idea that the enemy was less than human, that to kill them was a righteous act, a noble duty. Yet, as they sat together in the quiet of the camp, their world was turning upside down. The soldiers had done nothing but treat them with dignity, while their own commanders had abandoned them to suffer and starve. The contrast was undeniable, but the implications were too vast to process easily. In the darkness of the barracks, the women began to question everything they had been taught. They had been raised to see their captors as dehumanized monsters, as nothing more than obstacles to victory. But what they were beginning to see, slowly, painfully, was that war, and the propaganda that fueled it, had created these monsters. The men before them were not evil, not in the way they had been told. They were ordinary people, caught in a war they did not ask for, just as the women were. And in that realization, the greatest battle was not being fought on the front lines. It was being fought within their own minds, as they struggled to reconcile the ghosts of their past with the reality of the present. As the days passed, the internal conflict deepened. The women found themselves caught between the old world they had known and the new, more complicated one that was unfolding before them. Each act of kindness from the soldiers challenged everything they had believed, and each challenge brought with it a deeper understanding of their own humanity. But the question remained, could they let go of the hatred that had been instilled in them for so long? Could they forgive the men who had fought against them, and in doing so, free themselves from the psychological chains of war? The shift within the women did not go unnoticed. There was a quiet unease among them, a tension that lingered in the air. They had always been taught that their duty was to their country, to their emperor, and to the ideals of sacrifice and honor that had been hammered into their hearts from an early age. But now, in the confines of this American camp, they were seeing their captors in a different light, one that defied everything they had been told. The kindness they had received had sown a seed of doubt that could not be easily erased. It was one woman, in particular, who began to feel the weight of this doubt most acutely. Her name was Yuki, and she had always prided herself on her unwavering loyalty to Japan. As a young woman, she had been raised to believe that the war was a righteous cause, that her sacrifices were necessary for the greater good of her country. But the days in captivity were beginning to eat away at that belief. The American soldiers had shown her more kindness than she had ever expected, and each act of warmth from them made her question everything she had known. She began to wonder, were they truly the monsters she had been taught to fear? Were they so different from her, after all? One afternoon, as she sat in the barracks, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts, Yuki found herself reaching for a pen and a piece of paper. It was an act she had not considered until now, writing a letter home. In the quiet of the room, she began to put her thoughts into words, the weight of her emotions pressing down on her chest as she wrote. "I know not how to describe what I feel," she began, her handwriting shaky at first. "Each day I struggle with the idea of what it means to be a prisoner, but more so with the kindness I've been shown. I was raised to believe that surrender was the greatest dishonor, but here, in this place, I am treated with dignity. The soldiers who have captured us are not the monsters we were told they would be. They are kind, and I feel ashamed." The act of writing was both cathartic and painful. Yuki had always been a woman of few words, her thoughts reserved for the privacy of her own mind. But now, in the midst of captivity, she found herself questioning everything she had ever believed. Could she really send this letter home? Could she share her doubt with her family, knowing how it would be received? She hesitated for a moment, the pen hovering above the paper. She had been taught to uphold the honor of her family, to carry the weight of their expectations on her shoulders. Yet, in the face of what she had experienced, those teachings no longer felt as certain. Yuki's letter became a symbol of the growing doubt that had begun to take root in the hearts of the women. It was not just her struggle, it was the struggle of all of them. Slowly, over time, others began to speak of their own internal battles, the contradictions they faced. It started with quiet whispers during meals, shared moments of vulnerability, and uncertain conversations when they thought no one was listening. But as more women began to question the reality they had been taught, the seed of doubt began to spread. They could no longer ignore the humanity in their captors. They could no longer pretend that the enemy was a faceless, evil force. Yuki's letter, once sealed and sent, became a touchstone for the others. It was the first time any of them had spoken openly about their doubt, and it sparked a quiet revolution in the camp. The women, so long bound by loyalty to their country, were beginning to see the enemy not as monsters, but as men. The myth of dehumanization, the idea that their captors were less than human, was being slowly dismantled, piece by piece. The ripple effect of Yuki's courage would not be easily undone. It was a moment that would change them all, as they began to realize that the greatest battle they were fighting was not against their captors, but against the beliefs that had shaped their lives. As Christmas ended, the routines of the camp returned to their usual rhythm. The soldiers, while still treating the women with respect and dignity, became more distant, resuming their roles as captors rather than hosts. The women, too, fell back into their roles, living in the barracks, performing daily chores, following the orders given to them. But even as they resumed the motions of captivity, something had shifted inside each of them. They could no longer deny the truth that had been forced upon them by their experiences. Their captors were not the ruthless monsters they had been taught to fear. Instead, they were men who had shown kindness, who had extended humanity when they could have chosen cruelty. The dissonance between their past beliefs and the reality they were living in gnawed at them, each day more unbearable than the last. Every meal, every act of kindness from the soldiers served as a reminder of how drastically their understanding of the world had changed. They had been raised to believe that their enemies were a faceless evil, soulless, driven by greed and hatred. They had been taught to see them as less than human, as obstacles to be destroyed without hesitation. And yet, in the quiet moments of captivity, they had learned that these men, these soldiers, were no different from them. They, too, had families, dreams, fears. They, too, had been caught in the web of war, fighting for survival just as the women had. The contrast between the kindness they had received and the brutality they had known back home in Japan was stark. In their own country's camps, they had been subjected to harsh discipline, cruelty, and neglect. Food was scarce, medical care non-existent, and the guards merciless. But here, in the American camp, they were fed regularly, given clean water, and tended to when they were ill. The walls they had built around themselves, walls constructed from years of propaganda and cultural indoctrination, were crumbling with every gesture of kindness. How could they reconcile this with the memories of their training, of the lectures they had heard about the savagery of the Americans? How could they justify the kindness of the men around them with the cruel stories they had been taught to believe? The discomfort lingered in their minds like a weight they could not escape. They wrestled with it every day, trying to maintain the facade of loyalty to their country and their beliefs, even as they felt the truth slowly seeping through the cracks. They could no longer deny what they had seen with their own eyes. The soldiers were not their enemies in the way they had been told. The cruelty of war was not confined to one side. It was something that touched everyone, leaving scars on both the victors and the vanquished. And yet, as time went on, something more subtle began to change within the women. Their conversations, once filled with suspicion and fear, slowly began to shift. They spoke of their homes, of their families, of the things they had lost. The lines between captor and captive began to blur, not in a way that betrayed their loyalty, but in a way that acknowledged their shared humanity. They saw their own vulnerability reflected in the soldiers. They saw the fear in the eyes of the men when they spoke of the horrors they had witnessed in battle. It was a small thing, but it was profound. It was the beginning of a transformation, a shift that could never be undone. The women were no longer just prisoners. They were people struggling to survive in a world that had been turned upside down by war. And in the quiet moments, when they allowed themselves to acknowledge it, they saw something that had been buried for so long, their own humanity, reflected back at them, not in the eyes of their fellow prisoners, but in the faces of their captors. If you are enjoying this story, make sure to like the video and leave a comment below sharing where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how this unlikely moment in history reshaped these women's lives. The weeks that followed the Christmas dinner marked the beginning of a slow, irreversible transformation. The women who had once believed in the clarity of war, good versus evil, the righteousness of their cause, and the enemy's unquestionable wrongness, began to grapple with the complexities of the reality they were now living. Each day, as they spent more time with their captors, the lines they had drawn between themselves and the soldiers began to blur. The brutality of war had torn their world apart, but in its wake, it had also forced them to confront something they had never expected: the shared humanity that existed between them and the men they had once called enemies. It wasn't just the physical reality of their captivity that changed them, it was the emotional and psychological toll it took on their understanding of the war. At first, they had believed that their fight was justified, that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. But now, as they sat with their captors, shared meals, exchanged words, and even laughter, their sense of purpose, their sense of right and wrong began to shift. They saw not just the soldiers' faces, but their eyes, their vulnerability, their fear. The dehumanization they had been taught to impose on the enemy had broken down, piece by piece. In its place, they saw the people behind the uniforms, the men who had families, who had loved ones, who had been torn from their lives by the same war that had taken everything from the women. The long-term effects of captivity began to sink in as the months wore on. While their bodies were fed and kept alive, their minds and hearts wrestled with an ongoing internal struggle. The women began to speak of their families more often, of the lives they had left behind, and the world they might never return to. The kindness they had received from the soldiers had planted a seed of doubt in their minds, and now that seed had begun to grow. The war, which had once been so clear in its delineation of enemy and ally, good and evil, was now more complicated than they had ever imagined. The enemy was no longer the faceless mass they had been taught to hate. It was a collection of individuals, each with their own story, their own pain, and their own humanity, and that realization unsettled them in ways they could not fully comprehend. For the women, the psychological transformation was profound. The very concepts that had defined their lives, honor, loyalty, duty, were being upended. Honor had always been about sacrifice, about remaining steadfast in the face of death. But now they were faced with a new kind of honor, a humility that came with recognizing their shared humanity, even with those they had been taught to despise. Loyalty, too, was no longer as simple as pledging allegiance to their country. It was now a question of allegiance to truth, to the idea that kindness could exist even in the most unlikely of places. And duty? Their duty to their families and their emperor now felt distant, detached from the reality they were living. Their lives, their futures, no longer felt tied to the cause they had been raised to serve. The most unsettling shift, however, was the question that lingered in their minds. What happens when the enemy becomes human? What happens when the lines that once defined the battle between good and evil, the righteous and the wronged, begin to blur? The soldiers, once seen as the enemy, were now seen as human beings with their own emotions, their own suffering. This shift in perspective challenged the very foundation of the war they had fought. If the soldiers were no longer monsters, what did that make the war? What had they been fighting for all this time? This new perspective created a profound sense of disillusionment among the women. They could not simply return to their old lives, to their old beliefs. The world they had known before the war had been shattered, and in its place was a new world, one where the lines between good and evil were no longer clear. It was a world where the enemy was human, where even in the darkest moments of conflict there could be acts of kindness and mercy. For the women, this was both a blessing and a curse, a painful reminder of the complexities of war and of the humanity they had been taught to ignore. They were left with the question, if enemies could become human, what did that mean for the war itself and for their place in it? The day they returned home felt like a dream. As the women disembarked from the transport that had carried them back to Japan, their eyes scanned the ruins of the world they had once known. The landscapes they had left behind were unrecognizable. destroyed cities, crumbled buildings, and villages still scarred by the devastation of the war. But it was not just the physical damage that struck them. It was the emotional distance they felt, as if they had returned to a world that was now foreign to them. The time they had spent in captivity, the conversations with their captors, the simple acts of kindness they had witnessed, had irrevocably changed them. They had seen the humanity in their enemies, and it had reshaped their worldview. The reception they received from their families and society was not what they had expected. Many were celebrated as survivors, as heroes who had endured the worst and returned home. Yet, as they faced their loved ones, the women could not shake the feeling that something had shifted within them, something they could not explain. They had returned to a world that still clung to the myths and ideologies they had once embraced. The honor of their sacrifice, the pride of their service, was still a central narrative in Japan. But for the women, it no longer made sense. How could they reconcile their experiences with the reality of their homeland? How could they return to a life where they were expected to uphold the same beliefs that had led to so much suffering? The quiet revolution of thought that had begun in the American camp continued to grow inside each of them. They no longer viewed the world through the lens of absolute loyalty to their country, to their emperor, or to the ideals of war. Instead, they saw a more complex world, one where the enemy was not a monolithic force to be destroyed, but a collection of individuals, each with their own story, their own humanity. The soldiers they had once feared and hated had become, in many ways, their teachers, showing them that even in the most brutal of circumstances, kindness and mercy could exist. It was a lesson that could never be unlearned, no matter how much their homeland tried to cling to the past. The lasting impact of their time with the American soldiers rippled through their lives, shaping their future decisions in ways they could not have anticipated. Some of the women found themselves questioning the very foundation of the war they had fought, wondering if the cost had been worth it. Others, while not abandoning their loyalty to Japan, began to advocate for a more nuanced understanding of humanity and conflict. They had witnessed the horrors of war firsthand, but they had also witnessed the possibility of peace, of empathy, even in the midst of violence. As they reintegrated into a world that had not yet changed, the women felt a quiet sense of revolution within themselves. They had returned home to a country still trapped in the myths of war, but their experiences had shown them that the battle for humanity was not fought with weapons. It was fought in the heart and mind. And while the world around them may not have yet acknowledged the lessons they had learned, the women knew that their understanding of war, of honor, and of humanity had been forever altered. As we close this chapter of history, take a moment to reflect on the profound transformations that occurred, not just on the battlefield, but within the hearts and minds of those who lived through it. Like, comment, and let us know where you're watching from.